The Negro is the product of an American experience. And during this experience, Negroes developed certain characteristics and cultural practices which shaped and still do shape the way that they interact with the world. And so H.T. Kealing, who was the son of former slaves, an activist, and a committed leader to helping the descendants of slaves, he wrote an essay in 1903 describing the characteristics of the Negro people. And so we can find this account in this book here called the Booker T. Washington Collections. And we can go on here to page 68, where it says this: the characteristics of the Negro are of two kinds, inborn and inbred. And so there are two kinds of characteristics that Kealing attributes to the Negro. There's inborn and there's inbred, which is what this entire video is going to be about, right? And so he's going to explain what they both are. Let's continue. As they reveal themselves to us, this distinction may not be seen, but it exists. Inborn qualities are ineradicable. They belong to the blood. They constitute individuality. They are independent, or nearly so, of time and habitat. So he believed that these qualities could not be erased or changed within humans, and basically they're genetic. Now, I don't believe that the characteristics that he names in his book cannot be changed, but in his view, they couldn't, right? So in a bit, we're going to find out more about these inborn characteristics. Let's continue. Inbred qualities are acquired and are the result of experience. And so these characteristics are what he's describing as things that are picked up through the environment, through experience, through society, and so forth, right? And so these are basically learned habits and learned tendencies. Let's continue. They may be overcome by a reversal of the process which created them. And so these are the things which you as the human, connected with the innermost creative power, can change, right? These are the things that are within your control and that you can modify. And I understand both the inbred and the inborn characteristics that he names in this book to be both things that can be changed by the human. Let's continue. The fundamental or inborn characteristics of the Negro may be found in the African as well as the American Negro. But the inbred characteristics of the latter, which is the Negro, belong to the American life alone. And so these inbred or these learned characteristics that he describes in this book only belong to the American Negro. And why is that? Because these are the characteristics that the Negro picked up during slavery, right? And in that slave experience. And so we're going to see what these are when we get into that section. Let's continue. There is but one human nature, made up of constituent elements the same in all men, and racial or national differences arise from predominance of one or another element in this or that race. It is a question of proportion, meaning that all the people are made up of the same characteristics, but the question is how much or how less a group expresses any one of those characteristics, right? The proportion that he's referring to. Let's continue. The Negro is not a Caucasian, not a Chinese, not an Indian, though no psychological quality is in the one absent from the other. The same moral sense, called conscious, the same love of harmony in color or sound, the same pleasure in acquiring knowledge, the same love of truth in word or of fitness in relation, the same love of respect and approbation, the same vengeful or benevolent feelings, the same appetites belong to all, but in varying proportions. And this is true because all humans possess the same characteristics, but those expressions vary in degree or proportion, like he's explaining. And so culture and experience, these are two ways that determine the degree in which a quality or characteristic is going to be expressed by a person or a group, right? And so from here, let's go into find out what Kealing is going to describe as the inborn characteristics or the natural characteristics of the Negro that he's describing in 1903. Here we go. He is intensely religious. True religion is based upon a belief in the supernatural, upon faith and feeling. A people deeply superstitious are apt to be deeply religious, for both rest upon a belief in a spiritual world. Superstition differs from religion in being the untrained and unenlightened gropings of the human soul after the mysteries of the higher life, while the latter, more or less enlightened, feels after God. If aptly, it may find him. And this unknowable and all-powerful force will only be found by searching within. Let's continue. The Negro gives abundant evidence of both phases. The absolute inability of the master in the days of slavery, while successfully vetoing all other kinds of convocation to stop the Negro's church meetings, as well as the almost phenomenal influence and growth of his church since, and his constant referring of every event, adverse or favorable, to the personal ministration of the Creator, are things unique and persistent. And I will say that Negroes have always maintained some intuitive connective with the creative force, although the simplistic Christian doctrine that was placed upon them, that led them astray in the wrong direction. Let's continue. And the master class reposed more faith in their slaves' religion oftentimes than they did in their own. Doubtless much of the referential feeling that pervades the American home today, above that of all nations, is the result of the Negro's mammy devotion and loyalty to God. So intense religion is the first inborn characteristic of the Negro that he describes. The second is this: he is imaginative. This is not evidenced so much in creative directions as in poetical, musical, combinatory, inventional, and what, if coupled with learning, we call literary imagination. Negro eloquence is proverbial, meaning the Negro's ability to persuade with speech was proverbial or well known. Let's continue. The crudest sermon of the most unlettered slave abound in tropes and glowing tongues pictured of apocalyptic visions all his own. And indeed, the poetic quality of his mind is seen in all his natural efforts when the self-consciousness of education does not stand guard. The staid religious muse of Phyllis Wheatley and Rockling, somewhat jibing, verse of Dunbar show it equally, unpremeditated and spontaneous. I have heard by the hour some ordinary old uneducated Negro tell those inimitable or unable to be imitated animal stories brought to literary existence in Uncle Remus with such quaint humor, delicious conceit, and masterly delineation of plot, character, and incident that nothing but the conventional rating of Aesop's fables could put them in the same class. This was one of the Negro's learned skills and abilities, right? The power to bring a story to life, which is a very, very, very powerful skill, especially when it's used for the right purpose, right? Let's continue. Then there are more Negro inventors than the world supposes. This faculty is impossible without a well-ordered imagination held in leash by a good memory and large perception. This is very true, and when that imagination is put towards productive creations, then many things can be made manifest out in the physical world, right? So imagination was one of the inborn characteristics of the Negro that he's describing. The next one is this: he is affectionate and without vindictiveness, meaning not a seeker of revenge, right? He does not nurse even great wrongs. Mercurial as he is, often furiously angry and frequently in murderous mood, he comes nearer not letting the sun go down upon his anger than any other man I know. Like Brutus, he may be compared to the flint which, much enforced, shows a hasty spark and straight is cold again. His affection is not less towards the Caucasian than to his own race. Now watch this. It is not saying too much to remark that the soul of the Negro yearns for the white man's goodwill and respect, which is just as true of the Negro today, even though many people will go to the grave before they admit it, right? And so part of getting rid of this Negro consciousness is yearning for your own self-respect as a person, right? It's not looking for any validation from anyone else, right? And the strangest thing happens once you do this. People start wanting to respect you, right? They want to respect you because you have to understand, the more that you lean in, the more people lean back, right? And the more you lean back, the more people want to lean in, right? It's just like when you're dealing with a woman. The more that you chase a woman and you yearn for a woman, the less she desires to have you, right? You seem less valuable to her. And so it's the same thing with yearning for people's respect. The more you do this, the less valuable you make yourself, right? And so it's about self-respect above anything else, right? And so he's saying here that the Negro yearns for the white man's respect. Let's continue. And the old ties of love that subsisted in so many instances in the days of slavery still survive, where the ex-slave still lives. The touching case of a Negro bishop who returned to the state in which he had been a slave and rode 20 miles to see and alleviate the financial distress of his former master is an exception to numerous other similar cases, only in the prominence of the Negro concerned. So you see that? Riding 20 miles to make sure the former master was all right, right? Look at the mentality that was developed. Let's continue. I know of another man whose tongue seemed dipped in hyssop when he began to tell of the wrongs of his race, and who will not allow anyone to say in his presence that any good came out of slavery, even incidentally, yet he supports the widowed and aged wife of his former master. And there must have been countless stories that were similar to these during those times. Let's continue. And surely, if these two instances are not sufficient to establish the general proposition, none will gainsay the patience, vigilance, loyalty, and helplessness of the Negro slave during the Civil War, and of his good old wife who nursed white children at her breast at a time when all ties save those of affection were ruptured, and when no protection but devoted hearts watch over the great house, whose head and master was at the front fighting to perpetuate slavery, right? He's talking about the slaves that were still staying behind loyal while the slave masters may have been out there fighting to keep him as a slave, right? This is some wild stuff here, but this is the mentality that was developed during the slave time. Let's continue. Was it stupidity on the Negro's part? Not at all. He was well informed as the occurrences of the times. A Freemasonry kept him posted, as well as the whites were themselves, on the course of the war and the issue of each battle. Was it fear that kept him at the old home? Not that either. Many thousands did cross the line to freedom. Many other thousands, 200,000, fought in the ranks for freedom. But none of them, those who went and those who stayed, those who fought and those who worked, betrayed a trust, outraged a female, or rebelled against a duty. It was love, the natural wellings of affectionate natures. And so affectionate is one of the inborn characteristics that he attributes to the Negro, right? And so the next one is this. He has great endurance, both dispositional and physical. So true is the first that his patience has been the marvel of the world. And, indeed, many regarding this traits manifest in such an unusual degree, doubted the Negro's courage, till the splendid record of the 60s, this is in the 1800s, and the equal but more recent record of the 90s wrote forbearance as the real explanation of an endurance seemingly so at variance with manly spirit. Of his physical powers, his whole record as the laborer and killing task in the most trying climate in America speaks so eloquently that nothing but the statistics of cotton, corn, rice, sugar, railroad ties, and felled forests can add to the praise of this burden bearer of the nation. And that speaks to the Negro's resilience and ruggedness, which was necessary to survive in the slave circumstance, right? And so the next characteristic he describes is this. He is courageous. His page in the war record of this country is without blot or blemish. His commanders unite in pronouncing him admirable for courage in the field, commendable for obedience in camp. That he should exhibit such excellent fighting qualities as a soldier and yet exercise the forbearance that characterizes him as a citizen is remarkable, right? That's the Negro stepping up and earning a place within the country, right? Fighting those battles and standing out, right? Being courageous. Let's continue with the next one. He is cheerful. His ivories are as famous as his songs. That the South is sunny is largely due to the brightness of his rockling laugh and unfailing good nature bring to it. Though the mud seal of the labor world, he whistles as he hoes, and no dark brooding or whispered conspiring mar the cheerful acceptance of the load he bears. Against the rubber bumper of his good cheer, things that have crushed and maddened others rebound without damage. When one hears the quaint Jubilee songs, he might suppose them the expression of a melancholy people. They are not to be so interpreted. Rather are they the expression of an experience, not a nature. Like the subdued voice of a caged bird, these songs are the coinage of an occasion, and not the free note of nature. The slave sang of griefs he was not allowed to discuss, hence his songs. This cheerfulness has enabled the Negro to live and increase under circumstances which, in all other instances, have decimated, if not exterminated, inferior peoples, right? That's that ruggedness and that resilience. Let's continue. His plasticity to molding forces and his resiliency against crushing ones come from a Thalian philosophy. Unconscious and unstudied, that extracts Epicurean delights from funeral meats. The above traits are inborn and fundamental, belonging to the race everywhere, in Africa as well as America. And so these are what Kealing is describing as the Negro's inborn trait, right? Or the natural traits. Now let's go into the inbred traits, which he describes as something that's distinctly belonging to the American Negro. And so he says this: if now we turn to consider his inbred traits, those the result of experience, conditions, and environments, we may find that they exist mainly as deficiencies and deformities. Now, why would they be deficiencies or deformities? Because they were developed in the slave environment. Now, understand, if you take any people out there, it doesn't matter who it is, and you bring them in the slave environment, the American slave environment, with that same experience, when they come out on the other side, they're going to have these same type of character deficiencies. Understand. Let's continue. These have been superimposed upon the native soul endowment. Slavery has been called the Negro's great schoolmaster because it took him a savage and released him civilized, took him a heathen and released him a Christian, took him an idler and released him a laborer. And one thing from what he said that I could agree on is that slavery was a schoolmaster, right? Or more so, a process in a refinement phase, right? Where the final phase of this process would create an entirely new people with an advanced consciousness, right? That's the prize for those who can make it out of the pit, right? Who can get completely out of the pit. And so the trials and tribulations of life, these are the fires that people must pass through in order to elevate to the next level, right? It's just a part of the game of life. Let's continue. Undoubtedly, it did these things superficially. But one great defect is to be charged against this school. It did not teach him the meaning of home, purity, and providence. To do this is the burden of freedom. Slavery couldn't teach that because it wasn't meant to teach that. Freedom is the phase where these things and many more things were to be learned, right? And in this final phase of freedom, which is currently taking place, the Negro consciousness must be completely released, right? It has to be completely released in order to complete the evolutionary process, right? And he's going to explain what some of these defected parts of the Negro consciousness are. Let's continue. The emancipated Negro struggles up today against many obstacles. The entailment of a brutal slavery. Leaving out consideration of the many who have already emerged, let us apply our thoughts to the great body of submerged people. That's people that's all the way down in the pit. In the congested districts of city and country who present a real problem and must be helped to higher things. We note some of the heritages under which they stagger up into full development. Shiftlessness, meaning lacking ambition and motivation, right? To do something or to make something happen, right? That's shiftlessness. He says this: he had no need to devise and plan in bondage. And why not? Because the slave master is the one who did the planning and told them what to do. And so the Negro became accustomed to taking orders, right? And not taking initiative. Let's continue. There was no need for an enterprising spirit. Consequently, he is lacking in leadership and self-reliance. He is inclined to stay in ruts and applies himself listlessly to a task, feeling that the directive agency should come from without. That's waiting for directives to come from some outside people or waiting for some outside deity to present a solution, right? Looking in the absolute wrong places, right? That's what the Negroes learn to do, right? And doing that, it yields insignificant results. Significant results come from doing the exact opposite thing, right? So you have to stop thinking like a Negro and evolve, right? And so the next one is this: Incontinence, which means uncontrolled sexual appetites, right? Freaking on every woman that you can get a hold of, or freaking on all the men that your eyes desire. Now, I'll be the first person to tell you, I used to indulge in many uncontrolled freakouts with a lot of the women, right? But I recognized that I had to get control over this behavior because it was wasteful, it was risky, and it was also incompatible with the righteous life. And so the poise people, we don't involve ourselves with that type of behavior, right? Because we want to set good examples for our poise men and women so they can be quality candidates for other poise men and women, right? So incontinence is a characteristic of the Negro, right? Now let's continue going. It is not to the point to say that others are too. Undoubtedly, example has much to do with this laxity as neglect. We simply record the fact. A slave's value was increased by his prolificacy. Begetting children for the auction block could hardly sanctify family ties. It was not nearly so necessary for a slave to know his father as his owner. Added to the promiscuity encouraged and often forced among this class was the dreadful license which cast lustful Caucasian eyes upon likely Negro women. And so this sexuality developed from slavery, right? Negroes being used as breeders and the women being taken advantage of by the freaky white slave master. And so a cultural mindset developed from these experiences. And so the next characteristic he describes is this: indolence, which is laziness. And I don't think anyone is truly lazy in the general, right? It's just that people are lazy in certain areas. And so the Negro today, at least, has no problem using any amount of energy to find things out about gossip, playing sports, and to find the latest things on celebrity, right? And so forth. There's no laziness detected one bit in these areas because that's what many of the Negroes like doing today, right? And so nobody is lazy, like I said, in the general, but there are specific things that people are lazy in, right? Let's continue. Most men are, especially in a warm climate, but the Negro acquired more than the natural share because to him as a bondman, laziness was great gain, for he had no pecuniary or financial interest in his own labor. And so the Negroes weren't getting paid for the work that they were doing, and they had no financial incentive to want to do any work at all, right? So a mindset around working developed. Let's continue. Hence, holidays were more to be desired than whole labor days, and he learned to do as little as he might, be excused as often as he could, and hail Saturday as the oasis in a desert. And I don't blame them one bit for thinking that way, right? In that environment, because they were doing jobs that they didn't want to do. And then on top of that, they weren't getting paid for that. So I clearly understand why that mentality developed in that environment. Let's continue. The labor efficiency of the Negro has greatly increased since the emancipation, for self-interest is a factor now. And so they can finally earn some money, and there's more vested interest in actually working, which makes sense. Let's continue. In 1865, each Negro produced 2/3 a bale of cotton. Now he produces an average of 1 whole bale to a man. So indolence or laziness was another description, and we understand why now. And so here's another one of the characteristics. Improvidence and extravagance. Improvidence meaning not considering the future and having poor foresight, right? And he's relating this to the subject of money because he tied it in with extravagance, which means spending money recklessly. And so the Negro was spending money recklessly and didn't adequately consider the future when making those spending decisions, which means what? You have to do the opposite, right? When you're uprooting the Negro consciousness. And so let's find out a little bit more about this improvidence and the extravagance of the Negro. Here we go. He will drop the most important job to go on an excursion or parade with his lodge. He spends large sums on expensive clothing and luxuries while going without things necessary to a real home. Now, this was published back in 1903, where the Negro way back then was spending large sums of money on clothes. Now, do they still do this today? You better believe it, right? This is part of the Negro consciousness, and it has reincarnated itself into the people today. Let's continue. He will cheerfully eat fat bacon and pone cornbread all the week in order to indulge in unlimited soda water, melon, and fish at the end. In the cities, he's often seen dealing with the pawnbroker than the banker. His house, when furnished at all, is better furnished than that of a white man of equal earning power, but it is on the installment plan. And this is similar to what Dr. E. Franklin Frazier was talking about with the new black middle class in the 1950s. It's the same mentality that has jumped into the later generations of people who were earning more money. And so Dr. Frazier, he said that this new black middle class was buying things as if they had the income of the white upper class, right? Let's continue. He is loath to buy a house because he has no taste for responsibility, nor faith in himself to manage large concerns. But organs, pianos, clocks, sewing machines, and parlor suits on time have no terrors for him. You see that? No faith in themselves, because in the slave environment, they were taught to be dependent. And people have to have faith in themselves and faith in their ability, or what's going to happen is they're going to hesitate to try new things. And that's probably why you've taken the easy route on some things and why you've shied away from trying new things that were challenging, right? Because you don't have that larger faith in your ability, right? You're sitting there with the same potential ability as anyone else. But the difference is they didn't inherit the Negro consciousness, right? So you have to shake off the Negro consciousness and understand that you're just as capable as anyone else. Let's continue to the next one. Untidiness. That's messy. Here we go. Travel through the South and you'll be struck with the general misfit and dilapidated appearance of things. Palings are missing from the fences. Gates sag on single hinges. Houses are unpainted. Window panes are broken. Yards unkept. And the appearance of a squalor greater than the real is seen on every side. The inside of the house meets the suggestion of the outside, meaning both of them are torn up. This is a projection of the slave's quarters into freedom, right? That's taking the slave culture into the physically free world, right? And that's the result. Let's continue. The cabin of the slave was, at best, a place to eat and sleep in. There was no thought of the aesthetics in such places. A quilt on a plank was a luxury to the tired farmhand, and paint was nothing to the poor, sun-scorned fellow who sought the house for shade rather than beauty. Habits of personal cleanliness were not inculcated, and even now it is the exception to find a modern bathroom in a southern home, which is much different from today, because today, even in the projects, they have bathrooms and many other modern luxuries, right? Now let's move on to the next one. Dishonesty. This is the logic, if not the training, of slavery. It is easy for the unrequited toiler in another's field to justify reprisal. Hence there arose among the Negroes an amended commandment, which added to "thou shalt not steal" the clause "except thou be stolen from." It was no great fault, then, according to this code, to purloin a pig, a sheep, a chicken, or a few potatoes from a master who took all from the slave. And in the slave environment, that was completely understandable, right? The next one says this. Untruthfulness. This is seen more in innocent and childish exaggerations than in vicious distortion. It is the vice of untutored minds to run to gossip and make miracles of the matter of fact. The Negro also tells falsehoods from excess of good nature. He promises to do a piece of work on a certain day because it is so much easier and pleasant to say yes and stay away than it is to say no. And so the next one is this. Business unreliability. Here we go. He does not meet a promise in the way and at the time promised. Not being accustomed to business, he has small conception of the place the promise has in the business world. It is only recently he has begun to deal with banks. He who has no credit sees no loss of it in a protested note, especially if he intends to pay it in some time. The chain which links one man's obligation to another man's solvency he has not considered. He is really as good and safe a debt payer when he owes a white man as the latter can have. But the methods of the modern bank, placing a time limit on debts, is his detestation. And so paying debt in a timely manner has been poking at the Negro for some time now. And so the next one is this. Lack of initiative. That's using the power that you have within to take charge and to start something, right? Not waiting for someone else to come and do it first. Let's continue. It was the policy of slavery to crush out the combining instinct, and it was well done. For, outside of the churches and secret societies, the Negro has done little to increase the social efficiency which can combine many men into an organic whole, subject to the corporate will and direction. He has, however, made some hopeful beginnings. The next one is this: suspicion of his own race. He was taught to watch other Negroes and to tell all they did. This was slavery's native detective force to discover incipient insurrections. Each slave learned to distrust his fellow. And so the last one is this one here: ignorance. The cause of his ignorance, all know. That he has thrown off half of it in 40 years is a wonderful showing, but a great incubus remains in the other half, and it demands the nation's attention. What the census calls literacy is often very shallow. The cause of this shallowness lies, in part, in the poor character and short duration of the Southern schools, in the poverty that snatches the child from school prematurely to work for bread, in the multitude of mushroom colleges and get smart quick universities scattered over the South, and in the glamour of professional education that entices poorly prepared students into social work. We have discussed the leading characteristics of the Negro, his inborn excellencies and inbred defects, candidly and as they have been seen in the great mass whose place determines the status of the race as a whole. It would, however, be to small purpose if we did not ask what can be done to develop the innate good and correct the bad in a race so puissant and numerous. The mass is not inert. It has great reactionary force, modifying and influencing all about it. The Negro's excellences have entered into American character and life already. So have his weaknesses. He has brought cheer, love, emotion, and religion in saving measure to the land. He has given it wealth by his brawn and liberty by his blood. His self-respect, even in the basement, has kept him struggling upward. His confidence in his own future has infected his friends and kept him from nursing despondency or planning anarchy. But he has laid, and does lay, burdens upon the land too. His ignorance, his low average of morality, his low standards of home, his lack of enterprise, his lack of self-reliance, these must be cured. And these are character deficiencies that require inner work. And that's what the final phase of freedom is about. It's about the development of the inner character, right? And taking on a new consciousness to have a new experience in the world around you that will open up right before your eyes. And so hopefully you have learned something from this and have found this video useful, and it has given you some light to find your way on the path. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.